In every corner of the world, the military is seen as a symbol of honor, sacrifice, and discipline. The uniform is meant to inspire respect and loyalty, but what happens when the very individuals entrusted with this power begin to abuse it for their own brutal and selfish gains? When corruption creeps into the ranks, it not only destroys the reputation of the armed forces, but also shakes the confidence of the people they are sworn to protect. Now imagine when such crimes are not committed by shadowy figures or faceless men, but by women in uniform who were once hailed as pioneers, role models, and symbols of equality. Their betrayal cuts even deeper because society never expects women in such powerful positions to fall into the darkest forms of corruption and violence. The stories you are about to hear are not from movies or fictional thrillers. They are real cases of female army officers who crossed every limit of morality and humanity. These women rose to positions of authority in some of the most respected armies in the world, only to use their power for greed, cruelty, and sometimes even bloodshed. Their actions ranged from selling military secrets to enemy nations, to running illegal trafficking operations, to committing war crimes so horrific that they shocked international courts. Each case is a chilling reminder that evil has no gender, and corruption can infect anyone who chooses power over principle. It is often said that with great power comes great responsibility. But in the hands of these women, power turned into a weapon of exploitation. They misused their authority to intimidate, to silence, and to profit from the very people they were supposed to lead. Soldiers under their command became pawns, civilians became victims, and the armies they represented suffered deep scars on their reputations. The betrayal of trust in these cases is staggering because when a female officer earns her place in the military, it usually comes after years of proving herself in a male-dominated field. Yet, instead of paving the way for inspiration, they paved the way for disgrace. What makes these cases even more shocking is the brutality involved. We often associate corruption with money, bribes, and secret deals, but for many of these officers, their crimes extended far beyond financial greed. They orchestrated killings, manipulated wars for personal gain, and turned their commands into criminal enterprises. Some of them thought they were untouchable, believing their rank and gender would shield them from suspicion. But eventually, the truth caught up with them. Courts, tribunals, and even international war crime panels laid down heavy punishments, sending them to prison for decades, sometimes even life sentences, stripping away the very honor they once wore with pride. As we dive into the top 10 most corrupt female army officers ever jailed for brutal crimes, prepare yourself for stories that defy imagination. These are not tales of simple mistakes or bad decisions. They are tales of betrayal, blood, and broken trust. Proof that when corruption infects the military, it can be more dangerous than any enemy on the battlefield. The darker side of military power is something rarely exposed to the public. The uniform projects discipline, patriotism, and sacrifice. But behind closed doors, it can also become a mask to hide greed, corruption, and brutality. In most societies, the army is beyond question. It is an institution built on loyalty and secrecy, where the chain of command is sacred and obedience is absolute. That very structure, designed to create unity and order, can be twisted into a tool of abuse when a corrupt officer takes control. The people under them have no choice but to follow orders, even when those orders serve personal gain instead of national duty. And this is exactly where the line between honor and exploitation gets blurred. For female officers, the expectations are even more complicated. They are often celebrated as symbols of progress and equality, breaking barriers in a profession long dominated by men. But when such officers turn corrupt, their fall from grace is amplified. Society expects them to embody resilience, compassion, and integrity. Yet when these women abused their rank, they demonstrated just how easily power can corrupt, regardless of gender. In some cases, they used the trust people placed in them as a shield, believing that suspicion would never fall on a woman in uniform. That illusion allowed them to carry out crimes that shocked not only their armies, but the entire world. The corruption took many forms. Some used their rank to smuggle weapons across borders, feeding terrorist networks and criminal organizations. Others orchestrated financial scandals worth millions, siphoning money meant for national defense into their private accounts. A few were caught selling classified documents, leaking military strategies to enemies, and endangering the lives of thousands of soldiers for personal profit. What began as small acts of dishonesty, bribes, favors, or hidden deals, quickly escalated into full-blown criminal enterprises. The higher they climbed in rank, the more fearless they became, assuming that no one would ever dare question their authority. Yet the darkness went even deeper. Corruption was not just about money or secrets. It was about cruelty. Some of these officers stood accused of crimes that crossed into the territory of war atrocities. They were linked to unlawful killings of prisoners, torture of civilians, and the silencing of those who tried to expose them. Under their command, soldiers were turned into instruments of terror rather than protectors of peace. Civilians in conflict zones often bore the brunt of their brutality. As villages were raided, innocents were detained, and human rights were trampled under the excuse of military necessity. These acts were not isolated mistakes, but systematic patterns of abuse, carried out with chilling precision. When exposed, the fallout was catastrophic. Entire units faced dishonor because of one leader's corruption. Recruits who once looked up to their commanders with pride were left disillusioned, questioning the very values they had sworn to uphold. The trust between the public and the military weakened, as news outlets exposed stories of betrayal, abuse, and exploitation. International observers began questioning how such corruption could go unnoticed for so long. The answer, in many cases, was simple. Power protected them. Their ranks, medals, and reputation acted as shields, allowing them to operate above suspicion until the evidence became undeniable. Perhaps the most tragic part of this darkness is how it overshadowed the sacrifices of honest officers. For every corrupt female officer who betrayed her oath, thousands of women in uniform continued to serve with honor, courage, and dedication. But corruption stains everything it touches. The crimes of a few became ammunition for critics to question the place of women in the military altogether. Instead of inspiring a new generation, these officers left behind legacies of shame. Their downfall serves as a chilling reminder that power, when unchecked, can turn protectors into predators. As the world learned about their crimes, investigations deepened, and eventually, justice began to take shape. Some were arrested by their own governments, while others were dragged before international courts to answer for their brutality. Prison sentences followed, stripping away the illusions of invincibility they once carried. But even behind bars, their stories echo as examples of what happens when the line between service and selfishness is crossed. Corruption in the military is not just about broken rules. It is about lives destroyed, nations betrayed, and trust shattered beyond repair. When female officers crossed into this dangerous territory, their stories became some of the most infamous scandals in modern military history. These are not isolated mistakes, but brutal crimes that placed them among the darkest figures ever to wear a uniform. The following cases reveal how far corruption can go when power is abused without fear of consequence. One of the most notorious cases involved an officer who climbed the ranks with remarkable speed, admired for her discipline and leadership skills. Yet behind her polished image, she was secretly passing sensitive information to foreign intelligence agencies. At first, she leaked minor details, troop movements, supply logistics, believing no one would notice. But soon, her appetite for money grew. She began selling entire classified dossiers containing defense strategies that compromised her own nation's security. By the time authorities discovered her betrayal, the damage had already been done. Soldiers had lost their lives on missions that were exposed, and international allies had been placed in danger. When confronted in court, she showed little remorse, insisting she did it out of financial desperation. But the prosecution called it what it truly was: treason. Another shocking case unfolded in a war-torn region where one female commander was tasked with leading operations against insurgents. Instead of protecting civilians, she turned her unit into an instrument of terror. Reports revealed she personally ordered the torture of detainees, sanctioned unlawful killings, and allowed soldiers under her command to carry out atrocities unchecked. Survivors later testified about villages being raided, women assaulted, and families torn apart under her leadership. The brutality was so severe that international human rights organizations launched investigations, eventually leading to her arrest. In court, she tried to justify her crimes as necessary measures in war, but witnesses and evidence painted a chilling picture of deliberate cruelty. She was sentenced to decades in prison, stripped of her rank, and remembered not as a protector, but as a war criminal. Corruption also took a more calculated form in another officer's case. Known for her sharp intelligence and strategic thinking, she gained the trust of her superiors quickly. But behind closed doors, she was running an illegal arms smuggling operation. Using her military clearance, she diverted weapons shipments meant for frontline troops and funneled them into the black market. These weapons often ended up in the hands of organized crime groups and extremist organizations, fueling violence across borders. For years, she operated without suspicion, using her reputation as a disciplined officer to cover her tracks. When investigators finally uncovered the trail, the scandal shook the entire defense establishment. The fact that someone entrusted with safeguarding the nation's arsenal was instead supplying its enemies left an indelible scar. Not all crimes were about war zones and weapons. Some were about cold-blooded greed. One female officer in charge of military finances was caught embezzling millions meant for soldier welfare and equipment. The money was rerouted into offshore accounts and luxury lifestyles, while troops under her command were left without proper supplies on the battlefield. Soldiers complained about broken equipment, inadequate food, and delayed salaries, never realizing their own commander was the reason for their suffering. The betrayal cut deep because it wasn't just about money. It was about the lives of soldiers who paid the ultimate price due to her selfishness. Her eventual arrest exposed years of unchecked fraud, and she was sentenced to a long prison term after being branded one of the most disgraceful figures in her country's military history. Each of these cases demonstrates a chilling truth. Corruption inside the army is far more dangerous than corruption in civilian life. These women weren't just criminals, they were leaders who twisted loyalty, trust, and duty into tools for personal gain. Their actions endangered entire nations, cost countless lives, and shattered the image of integrity that the military is supposed to represent. And yet, their stories are only the beginning, because more names on this list reveal even greater depths of brutality and betrayal. Among the most chilling figures was a female officer who became infamous for her role in human trafficking. Using military transport routes that were supposed to deliver supplies to remote regions, she secretly facilitated the movement of illegal migrants, weapons, and even victims of trafficking networks. Soldiers under her command later confessed that they were ordered to look the other way whenever suspicious convoys passed. For years, she turned her military authority into a smuggling empire worth millions. When the scandal came to light, it revealed that she had ties to international crime syndicates, and her downfall became one of the biggest military corruption stories of her decade. Sentenced to a lengthy prison term, she remains a symbol of how deeply organized crime can infiltrate even the armed forces. Another case that shocked the world was that of a decorated officer accused of orchestrating unlawful killings during peacekeeping missions. Trusted by her superiors and admired by international allies, she carried an image of a strong leader committed to justice. But secretly, she was running covert operations where captured insurgents were executed without trial, and innocent civilians were labeled as enemies to justify her actions. Witnesses described how she ordered mass detentions and sanctioned brutal interrogations. International courts later revealed that her decisions led to the deaths of dozens of innocents, leaving families scarred forever. Her trial became a global headline, not just because of her crimes, but because it shattered the illusion that women in the military were immune to such brutality. Financial corruption also reappeared in another scandal where a female officer, working in logistics and procurement, created a network of fraudulent contracts. She awarded multi-million-dollar deals to shell companies that she secretly controlled, siphoning money from her nation's defense budget. The scheme lasted for years, draining funds meant for modernizing weapons and improving soldier welfare. What made her case unique was her ability to manipulate the system without raising suspicion. She carefully maintained her image as a disciplined and detail-oriented officer while building a personal fortune. But when whistleblowers exposed her fraud, the scale of the theft was so massive that she became one of the most hated figures in her country's military history. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the government, and she was sentenced to decades in prison. Perhaps one of the most disturbing cases involved a woman who openly collaborated with enemy forces. Stationed at a sensitive border region, she began communicating with hostile groups, trading critical intelligence for money and protection. At first, her betrayal seemed small, warning them of patrol times, sharing maps, and leaking radio frequencies. But over time, she provided detailed strategies that led to ambushes where her own soldiers were killed. The betrayal ran so deep that some military families blamed her directly for the deaths of their loved ones. When she was finally caught, the evidence was overwhelming. The court-martial labeled her a traitor, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The betrayal of trust in her case was so severe that even her own fellow officers refused to speak her name after her conviction. The last case on this grim list combined corruption, brutality, and greed in equal measure. A high-ranking officer, celebrated as a trailblazer for women in the armed forces, used her position to cover up atrocities committed by her unit. Villages under her control were repeatedly raided, civilians were displaced, and reports of torture surfaced frequently. Instead of investigating or punishing the perpetrators, she personally ensured that records were destroyed and complaints buried. For years, she maintained a spotless image in the media, celebrated as a symbol of progress. But when investigators uncovered her direct role in silencing witnesses and profiting from black market deals linked to conflict zones, her reputation collapsed overnight. Her trial was described as one of the most disgraceful moments in her nation's military history, ending with a sentence that erased every honor she had ever received. Taken together, these stories reveal that corruption does not discriminate. These women were once hailed as leaders, symbols of equality, and proof that gender barriers could be broken in the armed forces. Yet they chose betrayal, cruelty, and selfishness over service. Each of them left behind legacies of shame, becoming examples of how dangerous it is when absolute power falls into the wrong hands. Their imprisonment is not just about punishment. It is a warning to future generations of soldiers that the military uniform is not a shield for crime, and those who abuse it will eventually face justice. Justice in cases of military corruption is often slow, but when it finally arrives, it can be devastating. For these women, the very system they once commanded turned against them, stripping away every ounce of honor they had gained. Courtrooms that once would have applauded their service became the stages of their downfall, and the sentences handed down reflected the weight of their crimes. Each punishment carried a message. No rank, no medal, and no reputation can protect those who betray their duty. The officer who sold military secrets to foreign agencies faced one of the harshest sentences possible without the death penalty. After a lengthy trial that exposed the shocking extent of her betrayal, she was handed a life sentence. The court described her actions as treason of the highest order, noting that her greed had directly endangered the lives of soldiers on the battlefield. Her sentence was designed not only to punish her, but to send a warning across the entire defense establishment. Espionage would never be tolerated, no matter who committed it. The commander accused of torture and unlawful killings during wartime was tried in an international tribunal. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Testimonies from survivors, photographs of mass graves, and leaked military communications. The court rejected her defense that she had acted under necessity, calling her crimes deliberate and cruel. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down to a female officer. For victims' families, the punishment brought a small measure of justice, though no sentence could ever erase the trauma she had inflicted. The officer who masterminded an arms smuggling network faced a different kind of trial, one that drew international attention because her weapons had crossed multiple borders. Prosecutors revealed how her operation had fueled violence in conflict zones thousands of miles away. The court found her guilty of smuggling, corruption, and endangering national security. She was sentenced to 30 years behind bars, her assets were seized, and every honor she had ever received was stripped away. Her story became a case study in how military corruption can spiral into global chaos. Financial crimes also carried heavy consequences. The officer who embezzled millions meant for soldiers was sentenced to 25 years in prison. During her trial, prosecutors highlighted the suffering of frontline troops who had gone without supplies because of her greed. Families of fallen soldiers attended her sentencing, and their anger echoed through the courtroom as the judge declared her guilty. She left in handcuffs, her reputation shattered forever, a symbol of how corruption directly robs soldiers of their survival. In the case of the officer involved in human trafficking, her crimes shocked not only the military, but the entire nation. The court uncovered her direct ties to international cartels, revealing how she abused her military authority to run one of the most ruthless trafficking routes. Her sentencing was swift and severe, 50 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. Activists called it a landmark judgment, proving that no one, regardless of their uniform, could operate above the law. Global reaction to these cases was intense. News outlets across the world carried the stories, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because the perpetrators were women. For decades, female soldiers had fought to be taken seriously in male-dominated forces, and many succeeded honorably. But these scandals cast a shadow, fueling debates about whether women in high command faced enough scrutiny or accountability. Military spokespeople in several countries were forced to reaffirm that these were exceptional cases, and that the vast majority of female officers served with integrity. Still, the sentences served as public reminders that equality also means equal accountability. For the officers themselves, prison life was the ultimate humiliation. Once saluted by subordinates and respected by peers, they now lived behind bars like common criminals. Their uniforms, medals, and titles were taken from them. Instead of commanding troops, they followed prison orders. The contrast was so stark that their downfall became cautionary tales repeated in military academies around the world. Cadets were reminded that corruption might bring temporary power or wealth, but eventually, the truth catches up, and the punishment is merciless. Their sentences not only punished them individually, but also restored a sense of justice for the institutions they had disgraced. By making examples out of them, courts and governments tried to repair the damage to public trust. Each judgment carried a clear message. Corruption in uniform is not only a crime, it is a betrayal of an entire nation. And betrayal always comes with a price, one that even the highest-ranking officer cannot escape. The fall of these officers proves a timeless truth. Power, when misused, becomes one of the most destructive forces in human history. These women once stood as symbols of pride, carrying the weight of the uniform, saluted by their peers and trusted by their nations. Yet in the end, they chose ambition over duty, greed over sacrifice, and brutality over compassion. Their stories remind us that corruption is not a question of gender, background, or origin. It is a disease that grows wherever accountability is absent. What makes their betrayal even more chilling is that the world expected them to be trailblazers for good, but instead they carved their names into history as examples of disgrace. For soldiers on the ground, the damage went beyond the battlefield. Trust in leadership is one of the pillars of military service. When commanders betray that trust, the entire chain of loyalty collapses. Soldiers fight not only for their countries, but also for the leaders who guide them. In these cases, that bond was shattered. Many troops under their command were left questioning whether their sacrifices meant anything at all, especially when their suffering was tied directly to their leader's corruption. That betrayal cuts deeper than any enemy bullet. On a larger scale, the punishments these women received were not just about justice. They were about repairing broken faith. Nations cannot afford to let corruption spread unchecked in their armed forces. Military power is too great, too absolute, to be placed in the hands of those who lack integrity. That is why their prison sentences were so severe. They were not simply criminals. They were betrayers of oaths, guardians who became predators, and leaders who abandoned their duty. By locking them away, the courts and governments sent a message to every officer watching. No matter your rank, your gender, or your accomplishments, corruption will catch up to you, and when it does, it will erase everything you built. Yet, amid this darkness, there is also a lesson of resilience. The exposure of these crimes, the investigations, the trials, and the convictions all demonstrate that justice can prevail. Whistleblowers who risked their lives to speak the truth, journalists who uncovered hidden scandals, and honest soldiers who refused to stay silent all played a role in ensuring these officers faced consequences. Their courage is a reminder that corruption thrives only in silence, and when people dare to expose it, even the most powerful figures can fall. As we close this chapter, we are left with a sobering reminder. The uniform does not define a person's honor. Actions do. A uniform can inspire loyalty, but it can also hide betrayal. These 10 female officers chose a path that dishonored not only themselves, but also the countless women who serve with true dedication across the world. Their legacies will never be of glory or courage, but of shame and corruption. The lesson for future generations is clear. Power must always be balanced with accountability. Leadership must always be tied to integrity. And trust, once broken, may never be repaired. These women believed they were untouchable, but in the end, the weight of justice proved otherwise. Their downfall is not just a warning. It is a story carved into history, a reminder that no matter how high you rise, if you betray the oath of service, your fall will be greater than anyone could imagine.